Well, I fractured my patella.
Your kneecap.
My kneecap. I had a vertical break, like a potato chip.
The world froze the moment the words left the judge's mouth. Cameras flashed like lightning in a summer storm, their staccato bursts slicing through the silence that followed. Keanu Reeves stood at the center of it all, still, expressionless, his black suit absorbing the light like a shadow come to life. The sentence had been handed down, final, irrevocable, and though no prison walls would confine him, something heavier settled across his shoulders, the weight of an ending. Outside, a crowd pressed against barriers, the hum of confusion growing into a roar as headlines flickered across screens. Keanu Reeves, goodbye forever. He didn't speak as the guards motioned for him to stand. There were no cuffs, no chains, no bars, only the invisible kind, the kind made of time, of exhaustion, of quiet resignation. The courtroom had been transformed into a stage, and the entire world was watching. To most, it looked like justice. To others, tragedy. To him, it was release. His lawyer leaned close, whispering something about appeals, about loopholes, about ways out. But Keanu shook his head. He'd already made peace with it. The sentence wasn't punishment, it was closure. Outside, the reporters clawed for fragments of truth. Some claimed it was about a breach of contract, an industry scandal buried for years finally unearthed. Others whispered about exhaustion, about a man who had given too much for too long. One rumor even suggested he'd volunteered for this, a self-imposed exile from the industry that made him a god and a ghost in equal measure. The truth, as always, was simpler and sadder. He had chosen to stop being everyone's everything. The man the world loved was stepping out of it for good. That night, the streets of Los Angeles felt quieter than usual. Neon lights buzzed above posters that still bore his face. John Wick 5, Retribution, Cyber Shadow, The Resurrection Code. Studios had spent billions banking on his name, but all the money in the world couldn't buy another moment of him. He sat in the back seat of a black sedan, watching his own image blur past in reflections. Decades of roles, memories, and ghosts blending into one long goodbye. The driver didn't speak, nobody ever did, when Keanu rode in silence. As the car climbed the hill toward Griffith Park, he remembered the beginning, the auditions, the tiny apartments, the hunger that once lived behind his eyes. He'd been young then, reckless, hopeful. There was a purity in the struggle, a truth in the work that fame eventually diluted. Back then, every scene was a chance to feel alive. Now, every camera felt like a cage. The sentence wasn't handed down by any court. It had been building for years, a slow erosion of joy. The judge had only said out loud what Keanu already knew. It was time to let go. At home, his manager's messages stacked up like unanswered prayers. Offers, apologies, last-minute negotiations. "You don't have to do this," one read. "We can fix it. They'll listen to you." But he didn't want to fix anything. For decades, he had been the one constant in a changing world. The unbreakable, the humble, the eternal. But even legends get tired. Even light burns out. He walked through his empty house, walls lined with film posters and fading Polaroids. In one of them, a younger version of himself laughed beside River Phoenix. He touched the edge of the frame and whispered, "We made it, man, but it's over." The next morning, his face was everywhere again. "Hollywood in shock," read one headline. "Reeves quits forever," said another. But no one understood that quitting wasn't defeat, it was freedom. He wandered through downtown unnoticed, a baseball cap pulled low, a paper cup of coffee in his hand. The world around him spun faster than ever. Influencers live streaming their breakfasts, drones buzzing overhead, digital billboards flickering with AI-generated smiles. It all felt unreal, a parody of the life he'd lived. He paused at a crosswalk, looked up, and saw his younger self selling a movie he no longer remembered filming. The smile on that billboard looked tired. Later that day, a journalist caught up with him outside a quiet diner. "Is it true?" she asked breathlessly, her recorder trembling in her hand. "Is this really the end?" Keanu gave her the faintest smile, the kind that carried both warmth and finality. "Everything ends," he said softly. "That's how it matters." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her frozen in place, a single quote destined to echo across headlines and hashtags. He didn't see the tears welling in her eyes, the kind only a fan could understand. For millions, it wasn't just an actor retiring. It was the end of an era. By dusk, the internet had split into factions. Some claimed he'd been forced out, that studio execs had pushed him to the brink. Others insisted it was spiritual, that he'd found enlightenment and chosen silence. A few conspiracy theorists whispered of deeper truths, government experiments, secret messages, hidden symbolism in his films. None of it mattered. The truth was quieter than all of that. It was the sound of a man who had seen too much, done too much, and realized he wanted something no camera could capture: peace. That night, he visited the ocean. The same Pacific that had reflected his youth now shimmered with age. Waves rolled in slow, deliberate rhythm, like the world breathing. He sat at the edge of the sand, shoes off, pants rolled, wind in his hair. The moonlight carved silver lines across his face. Somewhere, far behind him, helicopters hovered, their spotlights sweeping in vain. He wasn't hiding. He was simply gone. The world could chase his name, but not his soul. He whispered into the waves, "Goodbye doesn't mean gone. It means I was here." In the days that followed, Hollywood convulsed. Projects were shelved. Directors panicked. Fans camped outside his last known address, lighting candles, leaving letters. Someone carved, "You're breathtaking," into the pavement. Studio heads held crisis meetings. "We can't replace him," one executive said. "We can only pretend to." But Keanu didn't care about the chaos he left behind. He spent his mornings tending to a small garden, his afternoons reading philosophy, and his nights writing letters he would never send. Every word began with "I'm sorry" and ended with "thank you." Weeks turned to months. His absence became a myth. Memes turned to murals, stories to scripture. The Keanu Code, someone called it, a philosophy of kindness in an age of cruelty. His silence became louder than his presence. People quoted his old interviews like gospel: "Be kind, be present, be grateful." Yet the man himself was miles away, living in the mountains, where cell service died and stars were visible again. He rode his motorcycle along empty roads, the wind his only audience. For the first time in decades, he wasn't performing. He was just being. One night, an old friend found him, a director he'd once saved from bankruptcy. They sat by a fire, sharing whiskey and silence. "You know," the friend said, "people still think you'll come back." Keanu chuckled softly. "That's the problem with forever," he said. "No one believes it's real." The friend nodded, staring into the flames. "They don't want to lose hope." Keanu poured another drink, his eyes distant. "Hope's a beautiful lie," he murmured, "but it's still a lie." In the months that followed, the world slowly adjusted. New stars rose, algorithms created digital replicas of him for movies he never made. Perfect, lifeless, profitable. AI Keanu, virtual Keanu. But none of them smiled like he did. None carried the weight of a man who had lived. Fans knew it too. They could feel the difference, that intangible humanity missing from the machine. His sentence had come true. His image would live forever, but the man behind it had vanished into silence. Then, one morning, a letter arrived at a Hollywood newsroom. No return address, no signature, just a wax seal and a single line on fine paper. "You don't need to see me to remember me." Inside was a photograph. Keanu standing by a lake, hair longer, face lined, holding a small wooden cross. The photo wasn't recent, but it was real. That was enough. The story went viral within hours, and yet, for the first time, it felt peaceful. No one demanded his return. No one shouted betrayal. The world finally understood. Goodbye meant freedom. Years later, film schools began teaching his career not just as cinema, but as philosophy. Professors spoke of the Reeves Doctrine, the art of walking away with grace. Students debated whether his sentence had been real or symbolic. Some said he died. Others believed he lived as a monk in Tibet or a mechanic in Montana. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was what he left behind: kindness, mystery, and a reminder that even the brightest light can choose when to dim. In a remote cabin surrounded by evergreens, Keanu Reeves sat beside a window, snow falling softly beyond the glass. His beard had gone white, his hands calloused from work that required no applause. On the table beside him rested an old script, edges worn, pages annotated. He smiled faintly, closed it, and whispered, "That's enough stories for one life." Outside, the forest exhaled a breath of wind through the trees. Somewhere far below, a distant radio played a song from his youth. He didn't move to turn it off. He just listened, eyes half closed, at peace. And so it was that the man who had spent decades saving the world on screen finally saved himself off it. The sentence had been final, yes, but not cruel. It was a farewell to noise, to illusion, to the endless cycle of fame and loneliness. The world mourned his absence but celebrated his truth. He hadn't been taken from them. He had simply chosen to leave before the applause faded. In that choice, he became something larger than a star, a symbol of freedom in a world obsessed with capture. The man who once said, "Be excellent to each other," had taken his own advice, and in doing so, disappeared into grace. Goodbye forever, Keanu Reeves. In the years that followed, the world didn't forget him. It only grew quieter about the loss. The headlines that once screamed his name had faded into nostalgia. A new generation discovered his films on streaming platforms, unaware of the storm that surrounded his departure. To them, he wasn't a man who walked away. He was a myth who once lived among mortals. Clips of his interviews resurfaced every year, re-uploaded with titles like "The Last Honest Actor" or "When Keanu Spoke Truth to Fame." His voice, calm and patient, still reached those who needed it most. A small foundation was formed in his name, not by a studio, not by a corporation, but by fans. It didn't fund blockbusters or celebrity tributes. It built shelters, funded scholarships, and planted trees. In memory of a man who never stopped giving, the plaque read. It was called the Forever Project. And though Keanu's name was whispered behind it, no one could prove he had any involvement. Rumor had it the donations came from a mountain address with no return label. Once in a while, grainy photos surfaced online. A man who looked like him, older, quieter, wearing a wool coat, walking through the streets of Kyoto or the hills of Switzerland. Each sighting sparked debate. Was it really him, or just a ghost of someone the world couldn't let go of? The images always disappeared after a few hours, as if erased by unseen hands. But the hope remained. The idea that somewhere Keanu Reeves was still watching the world, smiling at the chaos he left behind. Hollywood, meanwhile, tried to fill the void. They cloned his image, wrote scripts around his likeness, and even generated an AI replica that gave interviews on talk shows. It looked perfect, too perfect. The audience clapped, but something inside them recoiled. The warmth, the imperfection, the soul. It wasn't there. The ghost in the machine had no humanity. And so, for all their billions, they still couldn't resurrect the man they'd lost. Critics began writing essays about the Reeves effect, exploring how one person's silence had shifted the entire industry. Actors started demanding smaller roles, fewer interviews, more privacy. The endless churn of fame began to slow, even if just slightly. He taught us to vanish with dignity, one headline read, to choose peace over power. It was ironic, some said, that his greatest performance came after he stopped performing. In the solitude of his mountain home, Keanu kept writing. He filled notebooks with thoughts, sketches, and fragments of poems. Most were unfinished, like broken conversations with himself. One page read, "Fame is a mask that eats the face beneath it." Another said, "The final act isn't death, it's silence." He had no intention of publishing them, but decades later, those notebooks would be found, and the world would finally understand the man behind the myth. On one particularly cold night, as the wind howled through the trees, Keanu built a fire and sat watching the flames dance. The years had softened his features, but not his spirit. He still carried that same quiet humility, the same gentleness that once made strangers call him the internet's boyfriend. But here, alone, there was no audience, no applause, only the sound of wood cracking in the hearth. He smiled to himself and whispered, "I finally got the ending right." Far below the mountain, a filmmaker named Elena Cruz began working on a documentary titled "Goodbye Forever," the Keanu Reeves story. She'd never met him, but his disappearance had shaped her childhood. The film wasn't about loss, it was about liberation. She wanted to understand how someone could give the world everything, then walk away from it completely. Her crew interviewed hundreds of people, co-stars, directors, fans, even the judge who had read that sentence so many years before. Each had a different version of the truth, but all agreed on one thing: Keanu had found peace. When the documentary premiered, audiences left the theater in silence. There was no cheering, no crying, just reverence. It wasn't a movie about fame, it was a mirror held up to the world's obsession with it. And in that mirror, people saw themselves, desperate for connection, validation, meaning. The final frame lingered on a single quote, written in Keanu's handwriting: "You don't have to be seen to be remembered." The screen faded to black. That quote became a mantra. Influencers began posting less. Celebrities took sabbaticals. Even corporations borrowed his words for ad campaigns. But behind the commercialization, something real stirred, a longing for authenticity, a realization that maybe, in stepping away, he had given more than he ever did by staying. Humanity had found its reflection in his retreat. Years passed, and then decades. The name Keanu Reeves became synonymous with integrity. In classrooms, children learned about him not as a movie star, but as a philosopher of presence. His films were studied for their themes of loss, choice, and renewal. The Matrix became a metaphor not for simulation, but for the illusion of celebrity. Professors compared him to Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor who understood the burden of being seen by all and known by none. In his cabin, Keanu's hair had turned snow white. His movements slowed, but his mind stayed sharp. He often looked out the window and thought of all the lives he'd touched unknowingly. The fan letters still came, delivered somehow through the wilderness, stacked at his doorstep. He never read them all, but sometimes he'd open one at random and smile. A child thanking him for teaching kindness, a mother saying his roles helped her son through grief, a man who decided not to give up because of a line Keanu once said on screen. Those letters reminded him that even silence echoes. One morning he woke before dawn and rode his motorcycle down the winding trail to a nearby lake. The air was cold, and mist curled off the water like breath from the earth. He parked, sat at the edge, and watched the first lights spill over the mountains. It had been years since he'd seen a sunrise like this. Untouched, unfiltered, real. He whispered to himself, "This is what forever feels like." The wind carried his words across the still water. Later that week, the caretaker found his cabin empty. The fire had burned low, a notebook left open on the table. Inside, a single line was written across the last page. "Every story ends, but the silence after is the truest part." The chair beside the window was still warm. Outside, fresh snow covered his footprints, erasing the last trace of where he'd gone. When news of his passing broke, the world didn't mourn with noise. It mourned with stillness. Cinemas dimmed their lights. Studios paused their releases. Fans gathered not to cry, but to thank him. Across cities, candles burned quietly on sidewalks. Someone projected his image onto the clouds over Los Angeles, not as a brand, not as a legend, but as a man smiling one last time. The judge who had read his sentence all those years ago gave one final interview before her retirement. He wasn't being punished, she said. He was being freed. The sentence wasn't goodbye to us. It was hello to himself. The clip went viral, reigniting interest in that fateful day. But even now, no one truly understood what had driven him to it. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe enlightenment, or maybe he just wanted to prove that you can disappear and still be eternal. In the decades that followed, his story became a kind of parable. Artists who faced burnout quoted him. Activists invoked his name when speaking about compassion. Musicians dedicated songs to him. In Tokyo, a small statue was erected, not of Keanu the actor, but Keanu the traveler, seated on a bench with a serene smile. Beneath it, the inscription read, "Be kind, be present, be gone." Eventually, the digital world forgot him. The algorithms moved on, new idols replaced the old. But out in the physical world, in quiet corners of parks and libraries, people still found traces of him. A handwritten note tucked in a donated book, a carved KR on a wooden post, small reminders that he had once been here, real and human. And in that forgotten cabin, now reclaimed by moss and silence, a single photograph remained by the window. Keanu Reeves sitting beneath a tree, sunlight filtering through the leaves. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful. No signature, no title, just the image of a man who had finally found his ending and made it beautiful. So the sentence was final, yes. But it was never goodbye in the way the world understood it. It was a lesson written in quiet ink, that even the loudest lives must someday choose stillness, that sometimes the bravest act is to stop, and that the greatest stories aren't the ones that end with applause, but the ones that end with peace.